A Name is Earned, a short story by C.J. Vanderleip, read to you by Joshua Freisinger. The half-blood didn't have a name. She didn't really understand why. Yet, when sitting beside the Atani who called himself Hayden, and posed the question, "What is your name?" she could not come up with a response. He was a strange man. He didn't have pointed ears like she did. His hair was black and his eyes were brown. "Hello?" Hayden asked, poking the campfire with a stick. "Anyone in there?" "There's no one in the fire, Atani." He smirked. "I was talking to you. You didn't respond after I asked for your name." "Why would you want to know that?" "Well, I don't want to just call you Elf, because that would be rude." Hayden kept poking at the fire. The stick in his hand sent embers floating to the sky. She thought about what he said for a moment. It would be quite rude to call someone by their race rather than their name, but she didn't have one. I have not been given a name." The Atani looked surprised at the revelation. "You don't have a name?" "I do not," she said. "Does that matter?" "Well," the human scratched his head. "Humans tend to identify themselves with their name, and people tie things to names, and it means a lot when someone remembers your name, and yeah." She stared at Hayden quizzically. "What?" he asked. That made no sense at all. In truth, it did make sense, but that did not make the explanation any less strange. "I thought it did," Hayden grumbled. "Well, Atani, it didn't." Hayden rolled his eyes and put down the stick. He stretched his arms and looked around at the forest, and then up at the night sky. A droplet of rain fell on his cheek. The elf stared at the fire. She stared at its immortal form and passionate burning. Stray embers flew from the pit, flying into the sky, only to be shattered by a piece of rain. The rhythmic beating and shifting of the fire echoed within the young woman. "Hey!" Hayden shouted, drawing the half-blood from her stupor. She shook her head and looked up at Hayden, confused. "The storm's getting worse. We need to find shelter." The rain was pouring now. The fire was extinguished, lifeless and empty. Hayden led the half-blood out of the clearing and into the vale. They pushed through the ancient trees and ageless, vast roots that pierced the forest floor. "What's wrong?" Hayden asked, hopping over an expanding puddle. "Your question," said the half-blood. "It's still perplexing me." A flash of white light lit the sky. A distant clap of thunder echoed within the vale. "Don't think too much on it. Sometimes a name is earned." "It is not given?" "In most cases, it is." "Am I not one of those cases?" Hayden turned around and shrugged. "I think you're asking the wrong person. I'm just a traveler." The half-blood rolled her eyes. There was no truth in his statement. He was certainly not just a traveler. She'd seen that much from their travels together. He was an excellent. Strange as it was, she was asking an Atani for advice. She didn't really have anyone else. Her previous companions, albeit momentary, did not live very long. So she never had a companion. She found him more experienced than herself, more well-versed than she in dealings with other people, and his insight on others was certainly helpful. The two managed to find shelter beneath a large willow tree with long, droopy branches. "How long have you lived in the vale?" Hayden asked as he took a seat by the base of the willow. The elf thought about it for a moment as she sat beside him. She brushed her matted hair behind her ears. "As long as I can remember." "Since birth?" "Most likely." "Well, Who taught you how to survive?
Hayden scoffed as
Myself.
he glanced at an owl that hooted at him. There is no way you learned how to survive in a place like this alone. No caretaker? No parents?
No, Atani. Not all children are as fortunate as you. Hayden held her gaze. Never said I was fortunate. You were raised, Atani. The half-blood's voice was painfully sharp. That is more fortune than I ever had. Hayden didn't reply. 20 minutes of silence passed. It was filled with the continuous drones of the forest and pouring of rain. The occasional boom of thunder would cause the two to stand alert, then return to silence. Atani, Quit it, elf! You do not deserve to call me that. And what, pray tell, have you been calling me? Hayden's voice was low. It lacked the cheery intonation that the elf had grown used to. She sighed and took a seat on a nearby stone. She wrapped her hands around themselves. It is Elvish. It roughly translates to quickling. Why do you call me that and not by my name? Hayden growled. The half-blood hesitated. Because I feel like you are below me. What? She looked away from Hayden. What she said was the truth, but she knew it hurt his feelings. You thought I was below you?
Hayden stood and took a step towards her. In the distance there was a flash of white, then a boom of thunder. The half-blood also stood, but was far less menacing and aggressive than Hayden. Yes, I know it's terrible in hindsight, but we've traveled together for a year. After a year, you still choose to uphold the utterly stupid beliefs of your people. Hayden stepped closer again. Another clap of thunder. Never, not a single time have you called me Hayden.
I know. The half-blood, albeit scared, held her ground. And it is terrible, but we never talked about this until now. You've never asked me for my name either, not once. Because you seemed so guarded about it. His shouting echoed through the veil now. A roar of thunder followed his shouting. And, for the record, I did ask. It was the first thing I asked you. But you know what you replied with? Not your business, Atani. He was right. She sat back down and looked up at Hayden. She was at a loss. It took several moments for either of them to calm down. That's why I didn't ask, he murmured, breaking the silence. He looked down at her and sighed. I just got really, really angry when you assumed things about my past and my childhood. The half-blood nodded. I'm sorry. Would you be willing to tell me about it now? Hayden scanned around, then glanced up at the moon. Let's get a fire going. I should probably tell you. A fire was easily started with the nearby
Hayden
wood
glanced
and
at the
Hayden's
elf.
magic.
He scratched
The
his
two
cheek.
gathered around it.
I guess
sitting
my
across
family
from one
is as
another.
good as a place to start as any.
He grabbed a nearby stick and poked the fire with it. I was born to a noble family in Hinter, far to the north. The elf was about to interrupt, but Hayden shushed her. On my 6th birthday, my entire family was murdered. How are you alive? Hayden smiled. I was getting to that. I was saved by my older sister. When we were escaping, she shoved me into the sewers and told me to run while she would distract the assassins. I did, and never looked back. I'm sorry. Don't be. Hayden glanced up at her. There was no way you could have known. That being said, your assumption isn't necessarily wrong, but it still hurts. The half-blood nodded. Hayden tossed the stick behind him. I spent the next 10 years running from those assassins until they couldn't chase me anymore. So you hid in the veil? Hayden nodded. It all dawned on the half-blood. The reason he dealt with people so well, the reason he could instantly tell when somebody was lying, the reason why he knew not to ask her about her name by her response, the reason his magical capabilities were so potent, it was all a defense mechanism. He was trying to protect himself from those who would wish to kill him. Just like her. We're not so different, Hayden said with a smile. In fact, I think we have more similarities than differences. But your skill set couldn't be more different than mine. The half-blood smiled and leaned back. There is some truth to that. She stared up at the moon. She sat up. Earlier, you asked me if I had any caretakers, any parents. Hayden nodded. I lied when I said I didn't. I could tell. I was raised by my sister. The elf subconsciously touched her ears and turned her gaze to Hayden. She was human. We had no recollection of our parents. She and I found ourselves in the Vale one evening, lost and confused. So we did everything we could to survive. One night, she chose to take first watch. When I woke up, she was gone. I was alone. How long ago was this? 9 years ago. I am so sorry for your loss. She's not dead. The half-blood stared at the moon once again. She's alive. I can feel it. I believe you. The half-blood smiled and nodded. She basked in the light of the moon in tandem with the warmth of the campfire. The two sat in silence for a moment. The evening was exhausting. The elf perked up, breaking the silence. Thank you, Hayden. The human's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. What? What did you just say? He was excited. No, ecstatic at the use of his name. Do not make me repeat it, Hayden. The half-blood's tone betrayed the grin on her face. We should rest. Shall I take the first watch? Hayden grinned widely. Of course.